I wasn't in a good place that fall, and saying it that plainly is about the most honest thing I can do for you. I was 48, broad through the shoulders from years bent over engines, hands split at the knuckles no matter what lotion the pharmacist recommended, and I had built myself into a man who could fix almost anything except the life he actually lived in. My wife, Lena, had been gone 3 winters by then. Pneumonia, fast and mean in a season that already takes enough. My daughter, Kelsey, was 24 and living 2 counties south, and after enough calls where I answered in grunts and anger and long silences, she had done what sensible people do with fire. She backed away. I told folks I went up to my late father's cabin on Ramsey Ridge to hunt and thin deer before winter pressure set in, and that wasn't a lie exactly. I had tags in my pocket. I kept the old .30-06 clean. I checked the 0 twice before the first hard frost. But the deeper truth was less respectable and a lot less tidy. I went because the ridge had no witness stand, no casseroles, no careful looks from people deciding whether to ask how I was doing. Up there you could be quiet for a whole day, and the trees didn't mistake it for rudeness. Up there, grief had room to stretch out without anyone trying to fold it up polite. The cabin itself sat on inherited ground my father called the shoulder, a long slant of fir and alder above a creek that ran quick in spring and mean in winter. He built the place in '79 with salvaged beams and stubbornness, 1 room and a loft, wood stove in the corner, porch facing east. The roof still held because he overbuilt every truss like he expected weather to take it personal. He was right. By the time I moved in for the season, the first grip of the iron cold had started to settle into the hollows. That's what older folks around there called those early systems that came down dry and sharp, then turned to sleet without warning. It crusted the creek edges in skin-thin ice that looked solid until your boot punched through. It made your lungs feel small. It made sound carry strange and far. My days got narrow and repeatable, which was the point. Coffee before dawn, black and bitter enough to wake the dead if any were inclined. Split kindling. Feed Jasper, my old red-tick hound, who had gone grey around the muzzle and polite around everything else. Walk the lower fence line where elk like to lean on the wire and pretend they didn't understand property law. Check 2 legal snares set for coyotes that came too close to neighbouring calves some years. Back to the cabin by midday to patch whatever needed patching. Hinge pins, chimney seal, a draft under the door that had survived 3 owners, and every curse my father ever invented. Then I sat at the tree line with the rifle across my lap and watched light move over the draw until dark pressed me inside. Most evenings I never raised the gun. By the second week of September, I had gotten so good at keeping my hands busy that I could almost ignore the way my mind drifted when I was scraping gasket material off an old carburetor on the porch table. Almost. Sometimes I'd line up little washers in perfect rows and catch myself counting aloud in a voice that sounded like someone trying to stay present in a waiting room. One morning, I spent 20 minutes looking for a wrench that was in my back pocket the whole time, and when I found it, I told Jasper, "Well, good news, one of us is still sharp." He looked at me like he didn't want to be rude. That was about the level of comedy we had going. Town was 19 miles if the road stayed passable, 26 if freezing rains sent you around the low crossing. I made that trip once a week for diesel, oats for Jasper, and whatever I forgot to buy because my brain kept slipping gears. At Larkin's Feed and Supply, Milt Crane usually worked the register, thick glasses, thin patience, kind in the way older men are when they don't want credit for it. "You staying up there full time?" he asked me one Thursday while he rang up heater fuel and fence staples. "For now." He slid the receipt across and kept his hand there a second. "You eating regular?" "I'm not a child, Milt." Didn't say you were. I asked if you're eating. I looked past him at a rack of gloves I didn't need. Most days, he nodded like we had signed a treaty. Iron cold's coming early. Don't get proud with that stove. Keep dry wood stacked inside, not just under tarp. Wet wood makes fools out of practical men. He was right, and he knew I knew it. That's how people talked to me then. Not pity, not pressure. Just small, practical sentences laid down like boards over mud. The prevailing view around town, if you listened close, was that Earl Ramsay was still decent, just gone inward. I suppose that was fair. I paid my tabs, showed up when a neighbour needed a dead battery jumped or a tractor belt swapped, and kept my temper in public. But the inside of me had narrowed to function. I did what needed doing. I slept in stretchers. I avoided mirrors in bright light because my face looked like my father's in his final year, and I wasn't ready for that conversation with glass. Grief didn't come at me like a storm anymore. It lived in the walls like cold, always there, always drawing heat unless you kept feeding the fire. Kelsey crossed my mind hardest at night, which was inconvenient because nights on that ridge were long and mostly honest. I had her number memorized, of course. Parents do, even when they pretend not to. I'd pick up the phone, stare at her name, set it back down. Sometimes I typed a message and deleted it because every draft sounded either too formal or too needy, and I didn't know how to be either with my own kid. Once I wrote, "I miss your voice," then erased it and sent nothing. The screen went dark in my hand like water closing over a stone. Near the end of September, she called while I was outside splitting lodgepole, and I watched the phone buzz on the porch rail until it stopped. Then it buzzed again. I answered on the second ring, breath still hard from the maul. "Hey, Dad." "Hey." A pause. Not angry, just careful. "You up at the cabin?" "Yeah." "Okay." I heard traffic behind her, a turn signal ticking. "I just wanted to check on you. Aunt Jo said you've been up there a lot." "I'm fine." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine or fine like you don't want to talk?" I leaned the maul against the rail and watched Jasper nose through fallen pine needles for a scent older than both of us. "I don't know, Kels." "That's more honest than your usual answer." I rubbed my forehead with my wrist and left a streak of sawdust there. I'm trying to keep things simple. Simple doesn't have to mean alone. I swallowed and looked out toward the lower meadow where frost hadn't lifted yet. "I know." "All right," she said softly. "Call me when you can do more than one-word weather reports." "I will." She breathed out, and I could hear both frustration and hope in it, braided tight. "Take care of yourself, Dad." "You too." After the line went dead, I stood there with the phone in my hand for a long time. No drama, no breakthrough, just the ache of hearing your own daughter speak to you like she's approaching a skittish horse, gentle, slow, prepared to step back. October came in with hard glitter on the grass each morning and a sky that stayed low even on clear days, as if weather was collecting itself. The iron cold tightened. Creek edges turned slick by noon and brittle by dusk. The woodpile I thought would last until November was half gone by the 12th, and I spent 2 full afternoons bucking and stacking while my shoulders argued every lift. Work helped until it didn't. There's a point in a quiet life where routine stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like hiding. One evening, close to sundown, I walked the upper line where my father had set old cedar posts by hand. Half of them leaned now, but they still marked the boundary between our timber and state land. Jasper padded ahead, tail low and easy. A pair of mule deer fed down in the swale, ears flicking unbothered by us. The ridge smelled like cold bark, damp soil, and distant wood smoke drifting up from somewhere below. I remember that detail because the smell hit me with a memory of Lena's wool coat hanging by our old mudroom door, and for a second, I had to stop walking. When grief caught you out there, it was never cinematic. No knees buckling, no shouting at the sky. It was simpler and harder than that. Your throat tightened, your eyes burned. You kept standing because there was nowhere else to go. I sat on a cut stump until dark and listened to the evening settle in layers. First crows arguing down the draw, then jay-calls thinning out, then the fine dry hiss of wind working through needles. I held the rifle loosely and realized I hadn't chambered around all day. I wasn't sure whether that meant I was healing or failing at the one practical reason I claimed to be there. Maybe both. That was the trouble with that season of my life. Most truths showed up paired with their opposite. Back at the cabin, I lit the lantern even though I had battery power, because yellow light made the room feel less like a tool shed. I heated venison stew left from Sunday, fed Jasper his kibble with bacon grease stirred in, and sat at the table while the stove ticked and settled. The log walls held old marks from my father's habits, a hook where his hat used to hang, 2 nail holes from a calendar he never replaced, a penciled line at shoulder height where he measured my growth when I was 12 and still convinced adults knew what they were doing. I touched that line with my thumb and laughed once, quiet and short, at the memory of him saying, "You'll be taller than me by spring if you keep eating like a hired hand." I hadn't, but the wish was there in the mark. That night, wind came off the ridge hard enough to make the stovepipe hum. I woke twice to check the draft and add wood, each time standing on cold boards in my socks, listening for branches. Jasper lifted his head, decided the world was still in order, and went back to sleep. Around 3, I gave up pretending and made coffee too early, then sat by the window watching moonlight turn the frost white-blue along the fence rails. I remember thinking, plain as if someone had set the sentence in front of me on paper, that I could keep living like this for years and call it survival, and no one could prove me wrong. That thought scared me more than weather. Morning broke, pale and thin. I pulled on boots, shrugged into my canvas coat, and stepped onto the porch with my mug warming both hands. The woods below the cabin looked ordinary enough at first glance. Alders dark at the creek bend, spruce heavy with damp, breath hanging in front of me like smoke that had forgotten where to go. Jasper came out and sat beside my left knee, not leaning, just present. I took one sip, set the mug on the rail, and stared out at the ridge that had held my father, then held me, and maybe was waiting to see what kind of man I'd be when winter truly arrived. I stood there until the coffee went lukewarm, watching that low band of timber where our ridge dropped toward the creek, and nothing in me felt settled. The cold had a way of making every shape look sharper than it was, every branch edge cut clean against the pale sky, and I found myself searching those lines like there might be instructions written out there if I stared long enough. Jasper gave a short huff through his nose and looked up at me, waiting for a decision he trusted I'd make eventually. That trust felt heavier than the rifle some days. I picked up my mug, drank what was left, and said, "All right, old man, fence first." And he got to his feet, like that had been the plan all along. The upper ground was stiff with frost, grass crackling under my boots where the sun hadn't reached yet. I carried fencing pliers, a coil of tie wire, and the same habits that had carried me through most of my life. Find the break, fix the break, move to the next one. Halfway to the boundary line, I found where a cedar post had worked loose and listed towards state land, probably from last spring's runoff undercutting the soil. I knelt, reset the base with my boot heel and shoulder, wired it tight to the nearest standing post, and kept my hands moving until my fingers went numb through gloves. Work did what work always did. It narrowed the world to what I could touch. By late morning, the sun sat higher without giving much warmth, and the ridge opened into that wide, quiet look October gets before weather turns mean in earnest. I took the long way down toward the meadow edge, more from restlessness than purpose. A young buck stepped out from the brush 30 yards off. Broadside, clean shot if I wanted it. I did what a hunter is supposed to do. Eased the rifle up, checked my breathing, settled the sight. Then the buck lifted his head, ears forward, and looked straight through me like he'd seen tired men before, and understood we were not always dangerous. I lowered the rifle and watched him move off. White tail flick once, gone into alder shade. I told myself I was waiting for a better animal, cleaner meat, later in the season. I told myself a lot of useful things that day. The truth sat underneath all that practical talk and would not stay quiet. Pulling a trigger felt like a statement, and I had run out of statements I believed in. I ate lunch on the porch rail with Jasper at my boots, thick bread and a heel of cheese that tasted mostly like cold. The cabin smelled of split pine and old iron from the stove door. Across the drawer, wind moved through the fir crowns with that long, dry whisper that sounds almost like distant surf if you've lived inland too long. I caught myself speaking out loud for no reason except to break the stillness. "If you see me start a conversation with a stump, drag me back to town," I said. Jasper yawned and turned his head away, and I had to laugh once at myself, a short, rough sound that surprised me by being real. The afternoon stretched. I walked down to the creek bend where ice skinned the shaded edges, and water still ran black and quick in the center. My father taught me to read water there when I was 9, where current undercuts and where it holds. I could still hear him saying, "Don't trust a shiny surface in cold months. It looks patient, and then it takes your footing." I stood where he used to stand and tried to remember the shape of his hands. I got Lena's hands instead, flour on her knuckles from biscuit dough, tapping my wrist with a wooden spoon when I stole one too early. Grief does that. It chooses for you. I sat on a fallen cottonwood and let the sadness have its say. No dramatic collapse, just that steady inward pressure like weather pressing on a roof all night. I missed my wife in practical flashes. Who she'd have told me to call, what she'd have said when I shut down, how she could spot silence used as armor from 2 rooms away. I missed my daughter in a way that carried a different ache, sharper, because it was still fixable if I got out of my own way. I pictured Kelsey at 12 in muddy boots, trying to carry too much kindling because she wanted to be useful, refusing help until the stack toppled and we both laughed so hard we had to sit down. I hadn't heard that laugh in over a year. A gust came down the drawer and found the gap at my collar. I stood, flexed my fingers, and headed back uphill before my knees stiffened. On the climb, I stopped twice to catch breath, not because the grade beat me, but because my chest felt tight, with the kind of tired sleep doesn't fix. At the porch steps, I looked at my phone in my pocket, took it out, and opened Kelsey's contact. My thumb hovered over call. I put the phone away again. Not from anger this time. From fear I'd waste another chance with half answers. That felt just as cowardly, and at least I could name it. Dusk came early under cloud cover. I lit the lantern before full dark and heated beans with smoked sausage, then wrote 3 lines on the back of a feed receipt. Call Kelsey. Tell the truth. Listen more than you talk. I set the note by my mug where I couldn't miss it in the morning. Jasper circled twice on his blanket and settled with a sigh. I banked the stove, checked the door latch, and sat in the chair by the east window while night layered itself over the ridge. That was the loneliest hour for me when the day's tasks were finished and the mind had no more excuses. The trees outside were only darker shapes then, and the cabin glass gave me my reflection faint over them. A man with a work coat and a shut jaw, trying hard not to need anybody. I stayed there longer than made sense, listening to the stove tick and the occasional ping from cooling pipe. Somewhere downslope a barred owl called once, then again. Then even that stopped, and the quiet came in so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Sometime before dawn, I drifted off in the chair and woke with a stiff neck and a numb hand. Grey light was just beginning, thin as breath on glass. I stirred the coals back alive, made fresh coffee, fed Jasper, and stepped out onto the porch with the first mug while he did his usual circuit along the rail and steps. The morning had that brittle look that comes before sleet, cloud ceiling low enough to touch the ridgeline. Chickadees usually fussed in the brush by then, little arguments all over the yard. That day there was nothing. No chatter, no wing flick in the huckleberry. Just a clean hush laid over everything. Jasper stopped 2 steps off the porch and sat down facing the alder run below the cabin. Not stiff, not alarmed. His ears were up but easy, tail resting quiet on the boards. I waited for the growl or the warning bark he gave when coyotes skirted too close. It never came. He sat like he was waiting for a late friend. I felt the hair rise on my forearms anyway, less from fear than from being noticed by something I couldn't see. I scanned the tree line, the creek cut, the old game trail that crossed behind the woodpile. Nothing moved. The sky gave a faint spit of freezing rain, tiny, hard taps on the porch roof. I was about to call Jasper back inside when I saw it near the left corner post, right where the boot brush sat. 4 smooth creek stones laid in a neat cross, edges touching, and a green sprig of cedar placed over the center like a careful hand had set a mark. I stared long enough for the coffee to cool in my grip again. Those stones hadn't been there the night before. I would have noticed. I swept that porch every evening because wet needles made it slick. The stones were clean, no mud smear, no random scatter. The cedar was fresh cut, beads of moisture still on the needles. It was deliberate. That was what unsettled me most. Not strange, deliberate. I crouched beside them and held my hand over the arrangement, without touching it, like heat might rise from it if I waited. Jasper came and stood by my shoulder, sniffed once, then sat again, calm as fence posts. If it had been another person, he'd have looked toward the road for a truck, listened for a boot scuff, something. He didn't. He kept watching the alders with that same patient attention. There were practical explanations. Kids from town sometimes drove up logging roads for beer and bad ideas, though not usually in this weather, and never that early. A neighbor could have hiked across state land and played a joke, except none of my neighbors were the symbolic gesture type. Wind could blow a branch. Wind could not build a cross from matched stones and set cedar over it like a blessing. I said, quiet, mostly to hear a human voice, "All right then, I see it." The words hung in the cold and went nowhere. I finally touched one stone, just with my fingertip. It was cold enough to sting. Real, ordinary, creek-worn granite. I looked down at the slope toward the water and noticed, for the first time, faint impressions in the frost along the porch edge where someone or something heavy had stood in the night. Not clear prints, just softened depressions bigger than my boot, and spaced wider than any man I knew would step without trying. The ground there was mixed gravel and old root, bad for detail, and I found myself irrationally annoyed by that, like the ridge was giving me a riddle and smudging the answer at the same time. A thin gust pushed through the firs and brought the smell of wet bark, ice, and something else underneath. Musky and clean, animal but not rank. Jasper's nose lifted. He gave one low whine, not distressed, almost conversational, then settled again. I should have gone inside, maybe laughed it off, maybe kicked the stones aside and called it nonsense. Instead, I stood up, carried my mug to the rail, and looked out toward the alder line where my dog kept his attention. The woods stayed still. No threat in it, no rush, just that watchful quiet and the small cross of stones at my feet, cedar bright against grey boards, like the ridge had answered a question I hadn't known how to ask. I stayed on the porch another minute with my hand on the rail, looking from those crossed stones to the alder line and back again, trying to decide whether I was spooked or just awake in a way I hadn't been for months. The feeling wasn't fear. Fear is hot and fast. This was colder, steadier, like when you find a part on an engine that doesn't belong there, and you know the whole diagnosis is about to change. Jasper rose, shook once, and nudged my knee. Routine won by a narrow margin. I took my mug inside, loaded my day pack with pliers and gloves, and told myself I'd do the fence and forget about porch ornaments made by wind, raccoons, or my own overworked brain. I did not forget. All morning my eyes kept sliding back toward the cabin, as if I expected to catch somebody stepping off the porch and into the trees. Every time I rounded a post line, there it was, in my head again. 4 matched creek stones, 1 fresh cedar sprig, placed right where I'd see it before anything else. By noon I gave up pretending I wasn't curious. I walked back, set my pack by the steps and crouched beside the arrangement, like it might explain itself if I gave it enough respect. The stones were still clean, the cedar still green. I looked for prints and got only muddled depressions in gravel and old needles, too broad for my boot, too blurred to swear by. That should have ended it. Instead, it pulled me in. Inside the cabin, I cut an apple for lunch, ate half with cheese, and held the core in my palm longer than made sense. Then I laughed at myself, a dry little sound in an empty room, and carried it out to the weathered stump by the edge of the yard where my father used to split kindling. I set the core in the center like I was making an offering to a committee I didn't remember joining. If this is how people lose their minds, I said to Jasper, mine's at least being polite about it. He watched me with that patient old dog expression that suggests he has tolerated worse. The afternoon passed in practical tasks with a thread of attention running somewhere else. I mended a sag in the lower wire, restacked a row of damp fur rounds under better cover, and checked the first snare line before dusk. Nothing caught, nothing disturbed. What I noticed, standing there with freezing drizzle needling my coat, was the tracks around the set. Not in it, around it. Deep impressions in the soft patch where runoff stayed muddy even in cold spells, each mark longer than my hand, and spaced in a stride that made no sense for man or bear on that contour. The wire loop stood untouched, stake solid. No sign of panic, no churned earth, just a broad arc that circled the trap and moved on. I knelt and measured one print against my forearm, then against the sole of my boot. My boot looked like a toy. There are plenty of ways to lie to yourself if you need to. I tried most of them on the walk back. Groundswell, I said. Melt patterns. 2 overlapping elk tracks, maybe. But even while I made the case, another part of me was cataloguing details I couldn't file away. Weight distribution even from heel to toe. Pressure deep at the outer edge as if something huge moved carefully, not crashing through but placing itself with intention. That last part bothered me most. A heavy thing can be clumsy and still survive. This was deliberate. By the 3rd morning after the stones appeared, I woke before first light, with that odd alertness a man gets when he knows he's waiting on something he won't admit he's waiting on. The wind had dropped overnight. The ridge held its breath. I stirred the stove, pulled on my coat, and stepped outside with Jasper at my heel. The stump sat 30 yards off, pale in dawn grey, and I could see at once the apple core was gone. In its place lay a small scatter of red wintergreen berries, and one long shed feather, barred brown and cream, clean and dry despite the damp night. They weren't random. The berries were gathered in a neat little crescent against the grain of the stump, feather laid across them at an angle like a mark on a map. I stood there with my hands hanging open, ridiculous and still, while my mind worked through every ordinary explanation and came up short again. Jasper sniffed once and sat. "Okay," I said quietly. "I see that too." I didn't touch either item. I just looked, then looked at the tree line, then back. The chickadees started up a minute later in the huckleberry, quick bright chatter like somebody had turned sound back on. The return of those tiny birds settled me more than it should have. Whatever was happening out here, the woods weren't in alarm. That mattered. I spent that day in a strange kind of focus, as if grief had stepped aside and handed the shift to curiosity for a while. I checked both snare lines and found more of those same broad tracks in patches of mud and frost, never crossing through the wire loops, always bending around. One set came within 6 feet of a trap, then angled wide through sword fern and came back to the game trail beyond it. No animal does geometry in sleet unless it understands consequences. I knelt beside one print and felt foolish for speaking to open air, then did it anyway. "Excuse me," I muttered, moving around a cedar snag as if I were passing somebody in a grocery aisle. Then I stopped and laughed outright. 48 years old, widower, mechanic with split knuckles, apparently negotiating forest etiquette with nothing visible. The laugh fogged in front of me and vanished. I kept testing reality the only way I knew how. I made small marks with a carpenter's pencil on the porch post, where the stone cross had sat, then checked if anything shifted overnight. I scraped a clean patch of mud near the stump with the edge of my boot to catch detail if tracks came through. I left half a biscuit there one evening and found it untouched, while a fresh cedar twig appeared on the porch rail before dawn. No pattern I could monetize, no logic I could explain to men at the feed store without earning looks. Still, a pattern all the same. Exchange without taking, presence without pressure, signs placed where I'd notice, and then left alone. 3 days passed under low cloud and needles of freezing rain, and the iron cold settled deeper into the hollows, until every board on the cabin seemed to hold the chill. My grief stayed with me, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. I found myself scanning tracks before I scanned my own mood. I cooked actual meals instead of heating whatever was nearest. One afternoon, I even called Kelsey and got her voicemail, and instead of hanging up, I left a message with full sentences. "Hey kiddo, it's Dad. No emergency, just checking in. I'm up on the ridge and I'm doing better this week. I'd like to talk when you can." I listened to my own voice after the beep and was startled to hear something like life in it. That evening, the weather opened just enough to show a strip of pale sky above the fir line, and mist began to lift from the draw in long blue threads. Dusk on the ridge can flatten distance until near and far trade places, and I stood at the edge of the clearing with Jasper while light drained out of the grass. The world smelled of wet bark, cold mineral water, and that faint, clean musk I'd started to recognize without naming. No birds called, no branches snapped, just the soft drip off cedar tips and the sound of Jasper breathing. He took 2 slow steps forward and sat. I followed his line of sight toward the white pines near state land, where the trunks stood like old fence posts in the mist. At first I saw nothing. Then a darker vertical shape eased between them, so tall it seemed to belong to the trees before it belonged to flesh. It did not lunge, did not hunch, did not crowd the clearing. It moved with a measured slowness that read as restraint. Each step placed heel, then forefoot, as if the ground itself deserved care. Broad shoulders, fur dark as rain-wet bark, long arms hanging low and open at its sides. The head turned slightly away, not hiding, more like giving me room to choose what this moment would be. I could hear my pulse in my ears and the creak of my own gloves as my hands tightened on the rifle sling. I did not raise the gun. There are seconds that stretch because panic has you by the throat. This wasn't that. This was lengthening for a different reason. Like both of us understood, sudden moves would break something we hadn't named yet. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself I was looking at overlapping shadows, at a trick of dusk and grief and too many silent days. Then the figure shifted one step into cleaner light, and the proportions settled into plain fact. It was there, enormous, yes, but held together by a kind of patience I had no framework for. Jasper's tail thumped once against frosted grass. The figure paused at the edge of a small alder gap, maybe 30 yards out, then lowered one arm to brush a branch aside so gently the twig barely quivered. That tiny movement undid me more than size did. Anything that big could have pushed through like weather. Instead, it moved like a careful guest in somebody else's house. My throat went tight for reasons that had nothing to do with danger. I heard myself whisper, "Evening." Because apparently my body had decided courtesy was the only tool available. No answer came, not in words, but the head inclined once, almost imperceptible, and the figure remained where it was, neither approaching nor withdrawing. We stayed like that while mist slid between us, man and something I'd spent my whole life filing under stories, both of us outlined in the last blue light of day. I had expected, if I ever saw such a thing, that terror would take over. What came instead was a startling calm threaded with awe, and underneath that, a grief-shaped place in me recognizing another kind of solitude standing just beyond the clearing. After a long moment, the figure stepped back, one pace, then another, turning sideways to pass between the pines without brushing either trunk. Dark fur became shadow, shadow became timber, and then it was gone, as quietly as it had arrived. The woods did not explode into alarm. They simply resumed themselves. A single drip from a high branch, the faint hiss of wind returning in the crowns, Jasper rising and pressing his shoulder to my leg, as if to say, we could go in now. I stood there until the light finished draining out of the clearing, my rifle still slung and forgotten, my chest aching with a feeling I couldn't sort into any category I trusted. And for the first time since Lena died, I walked back to the cabin, carrying something besides loss. Jasper and I reached the porch in full dark, and I stood there with my hand on the latch like I'd forgotten how doors worked. The lantern glow through the window looked ordinary, the same square of yellow on rough boards, the same stove heat waiting inside. But I felt tuned to a different station than I had an hour earlier. I set the rifle by the table, unloaded it without thinking, and lined the cartridges in a straight row beside the salt tin. Jasper drank, circled his blanket, then came back and laid his chin on my boot. I scratched behind his ears and said, "You saw him too." Quiet enough that the sentence felt like a confession. The dog thumped his tail once and shut his eyes. I ate because I knew I should, not because I was hungry. Beans, venison, cornbread from yesterday warmed on the stove lid. The food tasted like smoke and metal and habit. My mind kept replaying that figure at the pines, the way he had turned his head aside, the way he had held his arms low and open, the way nothing in him had read like challenge. I had spent decades around men who crowded space on purpose, who use size like a tool. What I saw out there was the opposite: strength with brakes on. For a long while I sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a chipped mug and ran the argument I trusted most, the practical one. A bear on hind legs can fool distance, mist can stretch shapes, grief can bend perception. I gave each explanation its turn and watched each one fail under detail. Bears do not place a cedar sprig in crossed stones. Mist does not circle snares without touching them. Grief does not make my hound sit down calm in front of a 9-foot silhouette and breathe like he's listening to rain. I told myself, present tense and hard, this cannot be real, this is fatigue, this is loneliness with antlers. Then the memory of that slight nod came back and my chest loosened instead of tightening. Real or not, what stood there had offered me room instead of fear. That part I trusted. The wind rose after midnight, and sleet started tapping the roof in hard little bursts. I woke twice to feed the stove, and once to listen at the door, because I thought I heard weight on the porch boards. When I opened it, the storm was all grey motion and cold needles against my face. No shape in the yard, no eyes at the tree line, just Jasper beside my knee, nose high, calm as Sunday. I shut the door and laughed under my breath at myself. I'm checking the porch for giant neighbours now, I said. That's where we're at. Jasper gave me the same long-suffering look he used when I dropped food and claimed I meant to. Morning came low and blue, cloud ceiling almost touching the ridge, and I had stopped asking whether something was happening and started asking what kind of thing it was. I pulled on wet, cold boots, stepped outside and found the stump at the yard edge dusted with sleet. The feather and berries I'd left untouched were gone. In their place sat 2 fresh mushrooms, 1 pine cone split clean to the heart, and another cedar twist, woven tighter than any random fall of branch could manage. Not arranged fancy, not theatrical, just set where I'd see them and move around them. I crouched, studying the weave. Whoever made it had thumbs that worked like hands, not paws. The edges were stripped smooth, no torn fibers, no ragged pull. I lifted it to my nose, lifted, cold cedar, wet earth, that same clean musk beneath. I did not put it in my pocket. I set it back exactly where it had been and stood up slowly, like sudden movement might count as bad manners. The iron cold thickened through the day. Sleet turned to freezing rain, then back to sleet, the kind that coats every branch in glass and makes each step on a slope an argument. Wildlife shifted lower, closer to windbreaks and creek shelter. I checked my legal sets with a knot in my gut I didn't fully understand until I reached the first snare and found the loop tripped, stake untouched. No fur, no drag marks. The cable had been opened and laid flat on the ground, not broken. Opened. I stared at it long enough that rain started pooling in my collar. At the second snare, same thing. Loop down, wire straightened, stake still firm. Beside it, impressed deep in the slush, was that broad, human-like track with heel and forefoot, clear as carved wood. I set my pliers down, sat on a rotten log, and rubbed both hands over my face. "All right," I said to no one I could see. Message received. The wind shoved sleet against the hood of my coat and rattled the alder stems. But under that noise I felt something near me, patient and watchful, not pressing in. That evening, instead of resetting the snares, I carried both coils back to the cabin and hung them on a nail inside the shed. It was practical, I told myself. Bad weather for trap lines anyway. But another truth sat right beside that one. I no longer wanted steel loops in woods where deliberate hands walked around harm and left cedar on my porch. At dusk I took the rifle out of habit, then cracked it open, checked clear, and slung it empty over my shoulder. Jasper walked at my left through the lower meadow as sleet softened to a damp, bitter mist. Light drained slow behind the ridge, turning the clearing into layers of grey-blue and muted silver. We stopped where the old game trail crossed toward the white pines. I waited without knowing what I expected, hands open, breath smoking. He came into view without drama, stepping from behind a fir at the far edge of the clearing, maybe 25 yards this time. Closer than before, big enough that every nearby trunk looked thinner by comparison, dark fur matted in places from sleet, long arms hanging easy, palms angled slightly forward where I could see they were empty. He paused and looked straight at me, amber-brown eyes steady and unhurried. I'd never felt so plainly seen by anything that wasn't human. Jasper stood, tail level, then sat down between us as if taking attendance. I whispered, "Evening again," and heard my own voice shake, not from fear, but from the weight of admitting what I was looking at. He did not answer in any human way. He shifted his head a fraction and lowered his shoulders, a posture that made him look, for all his size, almost gentle to the point of shyness. Then he glanced toward my empty rifle, back to me, and stayed where he was. He was not afraid of me. That landed harder than any surprise. Every creature on that ridge had a reason to avoid a man carrying that shape of metal. He looked at me like I still had a choice to be decent. We held that distance for what felt like a long time, though the mist and failing light made minutes hard to count. He took one careful step sideways, reached down, and righted a small deadfall branch that had pinned a young spruce whip to the ground. Just lifted it, set it aside, and moved his hand away. The little tree sprang upright and trembled in sleet. It was such a minor act, almost nothing, and that's what made it hit me. Nobody performs for an audience with a gesture that small. That was simply how he moved through the world. When he turned to leave, he did it in full view. No rush, no attempt to vanish. 2 strides, a pause, one last look over his shoulder, then timber swallowed him. Jasper waited another 10 seconds and nudged my hand, ready to head home. On the walk back, my chest felt raw and open, like an old seam had been cut free. Overnight, the weather hardened and the ridge became a place of edges. Ice glazed the creek margins. Wind tunneled through draws and stole heat through wool and canvas alike. I spent daylight bucking deadfall and stacking dry wood inside, Milt's warning ringing true. By late afternoon, sleet came sideways, sharp enough to sting skin, and I almost skipped the lower fence check. Habit won. Jasper and I took the creek trail with heads down, boots testing each patch before weight. At the bend below the cottonwoods, Jasper stopped so abruptly I nearly walked into him. His ears were up, no growl, just focused attention toward the runoff channel where old barbed wire from a collapsed corner fence lay half buried in brush. Through sleet haze I saw movement there. A doe, thin from weather, hind leg twisted in that wire, sides heaving in short, panicked pulls. 10 yards beyond her, kneeling in mud and ice as calm as a man fixing a gate, was him. He had one massive hand around the wire strand, not yanking, just holding tension off the animal's leg while his other hand worked the snag point free from a branch crotch. The doe kicked once and stumbled, and he froze instantly, giving her space, head lowered. Not dominance, reassurance. He waited until she stopped thrashing, then eased the barb backward through the tear in her hide with a delicacy I'd struggled to match wearing bare fingers. Sleet ran down his fur and dripped from his forearms. He never flinched. I dropped to a crouch behind Alder, every muscle tight, not from fear of him, but from the intensity of the moment. The doe made a thin, ragged sound and tried to lunge. He released the wire at once and leaned away, opening a clear lane toward thicker spruce cover. She limped 2 steps, paused, looked back once with ears pinned, then bolted unevenly into the trees and disappeared. He stayed kneeling another breath, then stood to his full height and gathered the loose wire into a coil, lifting it off the game path and hooking it over a broken post where nothing could tangle in it. A clean-up job, quiet and complete. Only then did he turn his head and find me in the alders. I don't know what showed on my face, but whatever it was, he read it. He didn't approach, didn't posture. He touched his chest once with an open hand, then pointed with 2 fingers toward the spruce where the doe had gone, a simple directional gesture, and stepped back from the trail to give me room, partnership, not possession. "Thank you," I said, voice rough in the sleet. The words looked small out there, but they were what I had. He watched me 1 heartbeat longer, eyes steady, then dipped his chin and moved uphill through the timber with that same measured, careful gait, each step placed like he meant no harm to branch, soil, or anything hiding underneath. In 3 strides he was partly shadow. In 5 he was gone. Jasper trotted to the spot where the doe had been, sniffed the mud, then looked up at me waiting for instruction. I stood and walked to the old wire, tested the post, and felt my throat tighten for reasons that reached beyond that one animal. I had been living like gentleness was a luxury item, something you got after the hard work was done. Out there in freezing rain, I had just watched gentleness do the hard work first. I followed the limping tracks into the spruce for maybe 60 yards until I saw the doe bedded under low boughs, breathing slower, leg free, eyes wide but no longer frantic. I backed out without pushing closer. At the creek, I pulled the rest of that broken fence wire from brush and carried it shoulder-high back to the cabin, cursing the weight and my own neglect in equal measure. By the time I reached the porch, gloves soaked and face burning with cold, I knew 2 things plain. Whatever shared this ridge with me had chosen care when no one was watching, and I was out of excuses for staying numb. I leaned the coil of old barbed wire against the shed wall and stayed there in the sleet, bent over with both hands on my knees, breathing hard enough to taste iron at the back of my throat. The porch light threw a weak yellow fan across the boards, and in it I could see my gloves dripping, my coat dark with wet, my boots ringed in half-frozen mud from the creek trail. I should have gone inside right then and got dry. Instead, I stood straight, looked out toward the black line of timber, and felt the whole season catch up with me at once. Lena gone. Kelsey far away because I had made myself hard to reach. My father's place creaking through weather like an old ship. And now this giant, careful being moving through my ridge, undoing harm I had stepped around for years, because numbness was easier than change. Inside, the stove took off quick when I fed it cedar and fir. Jasper shook on the rug, sprayed meltwater across the floor, and came to stand by my leg while I peeled off wet layers. I toweled him first, out of habit. He tolerated it with dignity and mild annoyance, the same way he tolerated most of my decisions. I hung my coat by the stove, set a pot on for broth, and looked at the unloaded rifle still resting where I'd left it near the table. A clean tool, a familiar weight. I reached for it, not to use it, just to put it back in the rack. And when my hand closed around the stock, I felt my chest cave in around a sound I had not made in years. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair with the rifle across my knees and cried like a tired man. Not pretty and not brief. No speech attached to it. No dramatic words to the ceiling. Just grief coming loose from all the clamps I had cinched around it. I cried for Lena's laugh in the mudroom. I cried for the way Kelsey used to tuck her hands into my coat pockets when she was little, because mine were always warm from work. I cried for every call I dodged because I did not know how to sound like a father who was still alive inside. Jasper pushed his muzzle under my elbow and stayed there, steady as a handrail. I let him. By the time the broth boiled over and hissed on the stove lid, I had run down to that quiet, wrung-out place where breathing comes easier, even if your face is still wet. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve, stood, and muttered, "Good look, Earl. Real rugged." It got a half laugh out of me and a doubtful glance from Jasper. I poured broth into a mug, tore bread into it, and swallowed a few bites because my body needed fuel even if my heart still felt split open. Outside, sleet rattled the window glass in bursts. The iron cold had settled in for a long night. An hour later, the storm thickened from sleet to hard, slanting pellets that rang against the stovepipe, and the temperature dropped enough that the cabin boards popped as they tightened. I had just banked the fire and was reaching for a blanket when Jasper lifted his head and gave one sharp bark toward the door. Then came a sound through the wind, thin and desperate, a high bleat that rose and broke and rose again from the lower clearing. Not a rabbit, not a fox. Deer, and very young. I grabbed my canvas coat, shoved my feet back into damp boots, and reached for the rifle on reflex. Zizar. My hand stopped in the air. I checked the chamber by feel, kept it empty, slung it over my shoulder, and took the lantern instead. "Come on," I said, and Jasper was already at the door. The cold hit like a wall. Freezing rain stung my cheeks and ran down my neck. Lantern light shook with each step as we went down the trail, past the stump, through the alder cut, into the open where the clearing dipped toward the runoff channel. The bleat came again, weaker now, and I angled left around a wind-thrown fir to keep the lantern from blinding whatever was out there. Then I saw them in one frame, lit by sleet and moonglow, and my own shaking light. A doe stood on 3 legs near the edge of the channel, her free leg trembling, flank heaving. At her feet lay a newborn fawn, slick fur plastered down, too cold to rise. Kneeling beside it, broad back curved against the weather, was him. He had the fawn gathered against his chest with one huge forearm, while his other hand cupped over its ears and neck, shielding what he could from the ice. He rocked once, almost imperceptible, the way people do when they are trying to lend warmth by rhythm, as much as heat. He turned his head and looked straight at me. There was no challenge in his eyes, no warning, only urgency and a clear request. He shifted his body slightly to the right, opening a line of sight toward a dense stand of young spruce 20 yards upslope, dry underneath where lower branches swept the ground. Shelter. Out of wind. He looked back to me, then to the fawn, then to the spruce again. I set the lantern down and slipped the rifle off my shoulder. I laid it on the wet grass in full view and lifted both hands a little from my sides, palms open. My voice came out rough and small under the storm. "Okay, I'm with you." He waited, still as a stump, while I shrugged out of my coat. I stepped closer, slow, talking to the doe as much as to him. "Easy, girl. Easy now." Jasper sat 5 feet behind me, ears up, no growl, no fear. The fawn's sides fluttered too quick. Its tiny jaw worked in little useless motions. When I crouched, he lowered the fawn toward me with such controlled care that I had to reset my whole idea of strength again. The weight was almost nothing. Heat was almost none. I wrapped my coat around the body and tucked its legs in, leaving the nose clear. He kept one hand under the fawn until I had it secure, then withdrew without brushing my skin. We moved together toward the spruce. I cradled the fawn against my chest inside the coat, hunching over it to block sleet. He angled his body on the windward side, taking the worst of the weather with his shoulders and back, and used one arm to guide the limping doe from bolting downhill. Not touching her, just shaping space, step by patient step, giving her a lane that led where she needed to go. 3 times she stumbled. 3 times he paused and waited her steady, head lowered, posture quiet. Under the spruce canopy, the sound changed at once. Rain still ticked above us, but the hard sting eased, and the ground went from frozen crust to dry needle mat. I knelt in that pocket of shelter and set the fawn down against a root flare, still wrapped in my coat. The doe stood over it, sides pumping, eyes wide and shining in lantern light. I backed my hands away. The fawn twitched once, then found the doe's front leg with its nose and pressed in. That was the moment the second wave hit me. I had been operating on pure task until then. Move, cover, breathe, protect. Once the fawn settled and the doe stopped trying to flee, all the held-back years came forward again. Only this time they weren't just pain. They were pain and relief braided together so tight I could not pull them apart. I sat back on my heels in wet pants and put both hands over my face. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself I was kneeling in a storm beside a giant stranger and a deer family, and if I described this in town, they'd call Joe before they called a biologist. I told myself I should be scared, should be calculating exits, should be thinking in terms of risk. Instead, I felt safe in a way I had not felt since my wife was alive, and that truth broke me open clean. I started crying again, quieter this time, shoulders shaking, breath catching. Not from fear, from recognition. From standing in front of gentleness so large it made my own guarded life look narrow and optional. He did nothing dramatic with that. He did not come closer than needed. He did not reach for me. He simply lowered himself to one knee a few feet away and kept his gaze turned partly toward the clearing, partly toward me, like a sentry who understood grief and did not intrude on it. Jasper came under the branches and leaned against my side until my breathing slowed. When I could speak, I said, "I've been doing this wrong for a long time." The words fogged in the cold dark and hung there between us. I rubbed a hand down Jasper's back and added, "Thank you, for her, for all of it." He dipped his chin once, slow and deliberate, then glanced toward the doe and fawn, as if to keep the focus where it belonged. We stayed in that shelter while the worst band of freezing rain passed over. Time got strange in there, measured by the doe's breathing easing from panic to strain, by the fawn making weak attempts to tuck its legs under, by my fingers going numb and then warming again when I pulled them inside my shirt. At some point, I realized I was talking softly to Lena in my head without flinching from it, not bargaining, not asking for signs, just telling her what I was seeing, like we were sharing a porch view. I could almost hear what she'd say. "Well, Earl, maybe the world kept a few good surprises back for later." Near first light, the storm slackened to dripping and mist. A pale seam opened in the eastern clouds, enough to silver the lower trunks. The doe nudged the fawn twice, and on the third try the little thing got its feet under it and stood, wobbling, legs too long and uncertain. It found the doe's belly and latched, tail flicking in tiny jerks. I laughed once through the last of my tears, wiped my face, and looked over to where he had been kneeling. He was standing now at the edge of the spruce, turned toward the trees. He looked back at me one final time, eyes calm, rain beading on dark fur, and there was a depth in that glance I still can't map out in words. Not farewell exactly, not promise, more like acknowledgement between two solitary creatures who had shared work that mattered. He stepped into the timber without hurry, one stride, then another, careful even in departure, as if he refused to leave damage behind him. At the stump near the clearing, he paused long enough to set something down with his fingertips, then continued on into fir shadow until trunk and brush took him in, and he was simply part of the ridge again. No crash through brush, no grand disappearing act, just quiet withdrawal, the way dawn replaces night when you aren't looking straight at the line. I walked to the stump with Jasper at my heel. On the weathered top sat two smooth creek stones crossed clean and true, and laid over them was a fresh twist of cedar, tight woven and green. I touched the cedar lightly, then lifted my hand and left the arrangement where it was. Behind me, under the spruce, the doe stood steady while her fawn drank, and the first thin sunlight of morning slid across the clearing and found all of us still standing. I stood there until the sun climbed high enough to melt the crust off the stump, and I watched the doe nudge her fawn deeper under the spruce before they finally stepped out, slow and careful, into the thawing edge of the clearing. The little one staggered twice, corrected and kept up. I picked up my lantern with one hand and my wet coat with the other, and when I lifted the rifle from the grass, I felt no pull toward it at all, just the plain weight of an old habit. Back at the cabin, I hung my coat by the stove and set the rifle on the table. Jasper drank, then collapsed on his blanket like he had worked a double shift. I opened the bolt, checked the chamber again, even though I already knew it was empty, and put the cartridges back in their box. Then I carried the rifle to the rack and paused with my hand on the stock. "You've done what I asked," I said out loud, quiet and grateful. "I'm done asking it." I left it there and made coffee with shaking hands that were finally shaking, for a reason I respected. By late morning, when drip water started ticking off the eaves in a steady rhythm, I walked out to the stump and moved the crossed stones and cedar twist to the porch shelf beside the door, above where boots would never knock them loose. I did it gently, like handling something breakable, though they were only stone and branch. The older cedar weave from before was still by the steps where I had set it to dry, and I placed it beside the new one. 2 weaves, 2 crossed sets, and no story I could prove to anybody who needed proof. Proof stopped mattering as much as practice. I spent the afternoon pulling the rest of the hidden wire from the lower brush and rolling it into tight coils, cursing every snag I had left out there over the years. The next morning, I drove to town with the rifle in a soft case on the passenger seat and the wire in the truck bed. The roads were wet but passable, and by then the first week of November had turned the valley edges from hard silver to dull brown thaw. At Green's sporting counter in the back of a hardware store, a kid with a trimmed beard and careful hands checked the serial number, worked the bolt, and quoted me a fair price. I signed the transfer form, took the receipt, and felt lighter walking out than I had walking in. Not righteous, just clear. At Larkin's feed, Milt rang up dog food and heater fuel, then glanced toward my truck. "Didn't see your rifle case coming in," he said. "Sold it this morning." His eyebrows went up, and he gave me that long look older men use when they're deciding whether to ask one question or 10. "You quitting hunting?" "I'm quitting this kind," I said. "Keeping fences sound, pulling old wire. That's where I'm useful." He nodded once, slow. "My granddad used to say there's things on these ridges that notice what kind of man you are when nobody's watching." He slid my receipt over and left his hand on it for a beat, same as before. He never finished that sentence either. Then he pulled his hand back and added, "You look better, Earl. Tired, but better." "I am," I said, and meant it. 3 days later, with rain soft on the cabin roof and Jasper snoring by the stove, I called Kelsey before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, kiddo." "Hey, you got a minute?" "I do." I sat at the table, turning a cold coffee mug in my hands. I owe you a real apology. I kept giving you one-word answers like you were the problem and you weren't. I was angry at being hurt, and I took it out by disappearing while still picking up the phone. That's not fair to you. I heard my breath hitch and forced myself to keep going. I miss you. I want to do this better if you'll let me. The lines stayed quiet just long enough to hurt. Then she spoke, voice thin with held-back tears. I've been waiting to hear that for a long time. I didn't stop loving you, Dad. I just couldn't keep getting shut out. I know. Another breath, steadier now. Can I come up Sunday, bring groceries, boss you around, inspect whether you're eating vegetables? I laughed, real and easy. Please do. I'll even pretend to argue. When she arrived that Sunday, she came in wearing Lena's old green scarf and carrying 2 grocery sacks and a bag of oranges like peace offerings. She hugged me on the porch, hard enough to make my back pop, and neither of us pretended we were fine. Inside, she unpacked soup fixings, coffee, eggs, and a ridiculous amount of fresh produce I had no defense against. Jasper followed her like she had never been gone. At one point, she stopped by the porch shelf, touched the crossed stones with 2 fingers, and looked at me with a question she did not force into words. "You don't have to explain if you don't want to," she said. I leaned on the doorframe. "I saw something up here that chose kindness when it had every reason to stay hidden. That's as exact as I can be." She held my eyes, then nodded. No smile, no skepticism. "Okay, then let's choose kindness too." She bumped my shoulder with hers and went back inside to chop onions while I stood there swallowing gratitude like it might spill if I moved too fast. By mid-November, I had started spending my mornings helping neighbours with fence repairs instead of setting lines. Cal Mercer from the next ridge flagged me down one frosty dawn where his north pasture dipped into willow bog. We worked side by side with post driver and staples, breath smoking, gloves stiff. Halfway through, he glanced at the roll of old barbed wire in my bed and said, "You clearing all yours out too?" "Yeah." He tapped a staple flat and squinted toward the timber. "Probably for the best. Had a strange thing last week. My heifer got tangled near dark, and when I got there, wire was lifted clean off her like somebody held it up for her. Big tracks all around, none through the mud patch by the gate." He looked at me then, not grinning. "You ever see anything up here that made you change your mind about what belongs?" I drove a staple, kept my eyes on the post, and said, "I saw enough to start paying attention." That satisfied him. We finished the line in companionable silence, and when we were done, he clapped my shoulder once, firm and grateful. I never filed a formal report, and that was deliberate. I had no sample worth testing, no photo that showed what I knew, and no interest in sending men with spotlights into a place that had offered me mercy. The strange details stayed strange and stayed mine. Chickadees falling silent before gifts appeared, the clean musk on cold air, tracks that bent around harm, Jasper sitting calm where fear should have been, and those careful arrangements of stone and cedar that never asked for belief, only attention. I wrote the dates in a mechanic's logbook anyway, plain entries in block letters, then put the book in the drawer with Lena's recipe cards. Not hidden, protected. The last clear morning before first deep snow. I walked to the clearing at dawn with no lantern, no rifle, and a thermos of coffee I ended up sharing with myself on a fallen log. Frost glazed the grass. Steam lifted from the creek in low white threads. A pair of mule deer crossed the far edge and paused without panic, ears rotating, then moved on into alder shade. I waited an hour, maybe more. He did not appear. No dramatic sign arrived to close the loop. The only thing on the stump when I got home was a single cedar sprig laid straight along the grain, bright green against weathered grey. I set it with the others and felt no disappointment at all. I still miss Lena every day. That did not heal into absence. It healed into room. Kelsey calls twice a week now, and when I answer like I mean to stay on the line. Sometimes she comes up and we cook too much, and sometimes we just sit on the porch with Jasper between us and watch weather move across the shoulder. I kept the receipts from selling the rifle and the transfer copy in a folder by the door, right beside the notes for fence work I volunteer on each month. The snares are gone from the shed. The old wire is out of the creek bend. The porch shelf holds crossed stones and cedar twists that fade and are replaced when the forest decides, and I no longer need to argue with what that means. The world is still sharp-edged. Winter still takes work. Loss still visits without warning. But I know in my bones now that danger is not the only governing force out there. I watched a being built like a storm cradle a fawn like it was made of breath, and I set my rifle down in wet grass and chose a different life while dawn broke over us. That is what I carry. That is what stayed.